The record was only 47 seconds long. That was the first thing Cadet Instructor Valtara noticed when she pulled the file. Not the classification markers stacked 4 deep across the header. Not the redaction bars that had turned half the metadata into black corridors she couldn't walk down. The length, 47 seconds. She had been told this footage was the reason the Hegemony 7th Expeditionary Fleet had requested emergency psychological consultation. She had been told it was the reason 3 of their senior officers had submitted voluntary cognitive recalibration requests, a process that, among her species, was roughly equivalent to admitting you had seen something your mind refused to file correctly. 47 seconds. She pressed play. The lecture hall at the Interspecies Academy of Strategic Sciences held, on that particular morning, 219 cadets representing 31 species. It was not the largest cohort the Academy had ever assembled. It was, however, the first cohort to include 11 humans. This fact had generated considerable administrative correspondence over the preceding months. Vilthera stood at the base of the amphitheater, her lectern carved from the pale stone of Arath Prime, her display screens arranged in a semicircle behind her. The hall curved upward in concentric rings of seating, each ring slightly steeper than the one below, so that cadets in the back row sat nearly 6 meters above her head. She had taught here for 9 years. She knew the acoustics. She knew how sound moved in that space, how it pooled near the bottom and thinned toward the upper rows. How a student in the back could sometimes feel as though they were watching something happen to someone else entirely. She had prepared today's lesson for 3 weeks. The topic was officially listed in the Academy curriculum as Strategic Threat Classification, a Hierarchical Approach. In practice, it was the lesson every senior instructor at the Academy quietly called the anchor session, the one designed to establish, early in the academic year, a clear and psychologically stabilizing picture of where each species sat on the tactical threat matrix. Not to humiliate, not to rank in any cruel sense, simply to orient. The galaxy was large. Clarity was a form of mercy. She began with the Vorath Collective. Showed their fleet engagements, their resource efficiency, their documented combat record across 4 centuries. The cadets in the upper rows took notes. A few of the Vorath students sat a little straighter. She moved through 7 species in 40 minutes, standard material. The cadets were engaged. Then she reached the humans. This next subject, Valantra said, adjusting her display, requires a slightly different framing. She had chosen the footage carefully, or thought she had. The file had come from the Hegemony archives, cross-referenced against 3 independent journalistic records and 1 military after-action report. The subject was a human female designated in the military record as Sergeant Elena Vasquez, Infantry Division 7, involved in what the report called a rearguard action on a moon designated Cathara 6, a holding action. Rearguard operations were, across nearly every species in the Hegemony, considered acceptable only when the tactical calculus made survival probable. You held the line until you could retreat. That was doctrine. That was logic. That was, as far as Volterra understood military science, simply the definition of a rearguard. She pressed play. The hall went quiet in a way that halls rarely go quiet. Not the polite quiet of students pretending to pay attention. The compressed, held breath quiet of 219 beings watching something their nervous systems had not yet categorized. 47 seconds. In that 47 seconds, Elena Vasquez alone, with a weapon that the captions identified as being down to its final ammunition cell, held a choke point against an advancing force of 22 Keth soldiers for long enough to allow the evacuation of a field hospital containing 60 patients, most of whom could not walk. She did not hold it cleanly. She did not hold it efficiently. She held it the way something holds a position when it has stopped calculating whether holding is rational and has simply decided on a level beneath calculation that it is not going to move. The footage ended. The timestamp blinked, 0:47. Velthara turned to face her students, prepared to provide context, to explain the exceptional nature of the event, to situate it within the broader statistical picture that showed humans were, on average, a mid-tier tactical species with notable persistence metrics, but unremarkable technological output. Someone in the back row stood up. His name was Cadet Dresh Anath. He was Vorath. He was, by the Academy's own assessment, one of the most analytically gifted students in the cohort. He had scored in the 94th percentile on strategic modeling during entrance evaluations. He had not stood up to ask a question. Velthara could see that immediately, and it made something change in her chest, something she could not name for several seconds. He was standing because his body had stood before his mind had decided to. The 11 human cadets, distributed across the hall in ones and twos, did not react. They sat with a stillness that was, in retrospect, the second thing in that room that Velthara could not file correctly. "Cadet Dresh Anath," she said carefully. "Do you have a question?" He looked at her. Then he looked at the screen, which now showed only a frozen Frayne Vasquez mid-motion, face obscured by smoke and poor resolution, body doing something that the freeze frame made look almost architectural in its economy. Then he looked at the human cadet seated 3 positions to his left in the same row. The human cadet she would later learn his name was Torres met Dresh Anath's gaze without expression. "I have a question," Dresh Anath said slowly, "but I don't think it's the one you prepared an answer for." Sat. That exchange was not in the 47-second file. Velthara had recorded it herself in her incident report, which was the document that eventually landed on the desk of Hegami Strategic Command and generated, over the following 6 weeks, a cascade of classified correspondence that she was only allowed to read 1/3 of. The question Drashanith had asked was this: how many times has something like that happened? Not one record. The total count. Across all documented human conflicts. Velthara had not answered immediately. She had pulled the database. She had filtered for incidents classified as statistically anomalous persistence events, cross-referenced human military records, and generated a number. The number was not the problem. The problem was that the database categorized these events as outliers, statistical noise. She had been treating them as outliers for 9 years because the Academy curriculum treated them as outliers, because the hegemony's entire strategic model for human classification was built on the assumption that such events were the exception. The number suggested they were not the exception. She had not shown the number to the cadets that day. She had ended the session early, citing administrative matters, and gone directly to her office, where she had sat for a long time looking at her desk. She still didn't fully understand why. 3 weeks after that lecture, the first thing went wrong. It went wrong quietly, the way significant things often do before anyone realizes they are significant. A training exercise. Standard 5th week simulation, a 2-force engagement scenario. Asymmetric resource allocation, designed primarily to assess tactical decision-making under resource scarcity. Cadets were assigned to opposing cells. The Academy's simulation system tracked every choice, logged every resource expenditure, generated a comprehensive after-action analysis used to calibrate future instruction. The exercise was supposed to last 6 hours. Velthara checked the logs 12 hours later and found that the simulation was still running. She assumed a system error. She sent a query to the simulation office. The simulation office responded that the system was functioning correctly. The simulation was still running because one cell had not yet been eliminated or forced to a surrender threshold. The cell that had not surrendered was composed entirely of humans. Velthara pulled the resource log. In a standard 6-hour exercise, a cell operating on the remaining allocation should have depleted to the point of forced termination within 3 hours at most. The human cell had been at functional 0 resource allocation for 4 hours. They were still executing tactical decisions. The simulation was tracking their actions and finding, with increasing analytical confusion it seemed, that the actions were not consistent with a cell that had no resources. She looked more closely. They were eating their failures. Every position lost, they converted into information about the opposing cell's patterns. Every resource depleted, they used its absence as a signal to the rest of their team. They had stopped trying to win the exercise and had begun doing something the simulation's scoring algorithm had never been built to measure. "What are they doing?" asked Cadet Evaluator Pren, reading over her shoulder. "I don't know what to call it," Velthera said. The honest answer was, they were playing a different game than the one they had been given. The human cell was led, it turned out, by Torres. Velthera requested a debrief. She sat across from him in a small conference room the next morning, her notes arranged in front of her, her questions prepared. Torres was 22 years old by the human calendar. He had a quiet face, the kind that didn't offer information easily. He sat with his hands flat on the table. "Your cell had no viable path to victory after hour 3, Valanor said. The resource calculus was terminal. "Yes," Torres said. "You continued for 9 more hours." "Yes." She waited. He didn't add anything. "Can you explain the reasoning?" she asked. He looked at his hands for a moment. "What was the opposing cell doing while we were doing that?" Voltara paused. She hadn't checked the opposing cell's psychological state logs. She pulled them now on her tablet, scanned the entries. The opposing cell had spent the final 6 hours in a state the psychological metrics labeled elevated anticipatory stress. They had been waiting for the human cell to collapse. They had structured their entire late-stage strategy around that imminent collapse. And the collapse had not come, and the not coming had done something to the opposing cell's decision-making that the metrics were struggling to quantify. "They were afraid of you," Voltara said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. It was simply what the data said. Torres nodded, like this was not surprising. "But you couldn't win," she said. "We couldn't beat them in the exercise," Torres said. "That's different." She looked at him for a long time. "How is that different?" He met her eyes, and there was something in the quality of his attention that she found, despite herself, slightly difficult to hold. "We weren't trying to win the exercise," he said. "We were trying to make them afraid of the next one." She thought about that conversation for a long time. She was still thinking about it 6 weeks later, when the second file arrived on her desk, the one she had not requested, the one that carried 4 classification markers and a cover note from a Japanese strategic command that read, in its entirety, "We believe you should see this before the next cohort assessment." The file was not 47 seconds. It was 11 hours, 23 minutes, and 41 seconds of uncut footage from a border engagement on a planet called Dura Station, 6 years before the current cohort had enrolled at the academy. Veltha Ra watched it over 2 evenings, alone in her office, the hall quiet around her. By the 4th hour, she had stopped taking notes. By the 7th hour, she understood why the hegemony's senior officers had requested cognitive recalibration. It wasn't the violence. She had cataloged violence for 9 years. It wasn't the tactical decisions which were aggressive but not unprecedented. It was the footage from hour 6 when the human unit had been isolated, cut off, given no viable extraction window, officially classified by their own command structure as a non-recoverable asset, and had been told this via comm channel. She could see the moment the notification came in because the unit commander woman named Reyes, not much older than Torres, had listened, nodded once, and then turned to her unit and said something that the translation matrix rendered as, "Okay." Different priorities now, and they had kept fighting. For 5 more hours, not because they believed they would be rescued. The comm logs confirmed they had been told, explicitly, they would not be rescued. They kept fighting because on the other side of their position was a civilian settlement of 4,000 people, and the math on what happened to those people if the human unit stopped fighting was the kind of math that apparently the humans had decided they were not willing to do. Veltara sat in her office after finishing the footage and looked at her hands. She had spent 9 years teaching cadets how to classify threats, how to evaluate species based on documented capability, how to build a clear, rational picture of a universe that rewarded clear, rational thought. She now understood, been measuring the wrong thing entirely. She was not prepared, 3 days later, for what the database showed her when she ran the search Dreshanath had originally requested. She had been avoiding it. She ran it now. The total count of documented anomalous persistence events in human military history engagements where individual humans or small human units had continued to operate past the point at which any rational species would have stopped was not a statistical outlier figure. It was nearly 40% of all documented human engagements. 40%. She sat with that number for a very long time. She had been showing her cadets Elena Vasquez as an exception, as the extreme upper tail of human behavior, as the anomaly you discussed to illustrate the boundaries of the distribution. Elena Vasquez was not the tail of the distribution. Elena Vasquez was close to the middle. The question that hit her then, the question that she suddenly understood, was the question the hegemony's senior command had been sitting with, the question that explained the cognitive recalibration requests, the question that explained 4 classification markers on a cover note that contained only one sentence, was not, "Why do humans do this?" The question was, "What do you do with the species where this is normal?" Snot is. She called Torres into her office that afternoon. He arrived promptly, sat in the same chair, hands flat on the table again. She wondered if that was habitual or deliberate. She found she couldn't tell. "I've been looking at the aggregate records," she said. She did not specify which records. "For your species." "All right," he said. "The pattern isn't exceptional," she said. "It's not a cultural anomaly. Not a psychological outlier subset. The pattern is." She paused, aware of how the next word was going to land, representative. He nodded. "Does that surprise you?" she asked. "No," he said. "Did you know, coming in here, that we classified your species as mid-tier?" A beat. He didn't answer immediately, and the pause itself told her something. "We knew the hegemony's assessment, yes. And?" He looked at the wall to the left of her, at nothing in particular. "We thought you'd figure it out." She felt something shift in the room. "You thought we'd—" She stopped. "You knew the assessment was wrong." "We thought the methodology was incomplete," he said, with the same careful neutrality he had used in every previous conversation, and she was just now understanding that the neutrality was not disengagement, it was precision. He was choosing each word with the same care that his unit in the simulation had chosen each remaining resource. "What is the correct methodology?" she asked. He looked at her directly then, and for the first time she saw something cross his face that was not neutral, not quite. Something that might have been, in a human, the expression you make when you're about to explain something you've been waiting a long time to say. "Don't ask what we can do," he said. "Ask what we'll accept losing to keep doing it." Third file came without warning. It came to the Academy's standard research distribution system, tagged as supplementary curriculum material, which meant Belthara received it the same moment every senior instructor in the building did. She opened it at her desk. Others, she would later learn, opened it in hallways, in dining halls, in mid-conversation. The file contained a single document, 32 pages, no classification markers. The header read, "Post-Engagement Psychological Assessment, Human Combat Personnel, Sample Size 1400. She read it twice. The assessment was not about what humans could endure physically. That data existed elsewhere and was already, she now understood, being systematically misread. The assessment was about what happened inside human psychology during catastrophic loss. What happened to their decision-making when the situation became objectively unwinnable? What happened to their cohesion when they were told explicitly, clearly, without ambiguity, that survival was no longer probable? The assessment's conclusion was careful, academic, written in the flat language of scientific documentation. It said, in most species studied, catastrophic loss functions as a termination event for organized resistance. Among human subjects, catastrophic loss appears to function in a significant subset of cases as a motivational state change rather than a termination event. The psychological mechanism underlying this state change is not fully understood. Current hypotheses include elevated commitment to non-personal outcome metrics, dissociation from survival calculus, and what several researchers have termed forward attachment, a cognitive state in which the human's primary orientation is directed not toward their own continuity, but toward the continuity of a future they will not personally experience. Valera read that last sentence 3 times. Forward attachment. A cognitive state in which the human's primary orientation is directed not toward their own continuity, but toward the continuity of a future they will not personally experience. She thought about Reyes. Okay, different priorities now. She thought about Vasquez. 47 seconds. She thought about Torres. We were trying to make them afraid of the next one. The document's final paragraph had one sentence that the author had chosen not to elaborate on, had simply placed at the end of 32 pages of careful analysis and left there without comment, the way you leave something in a room for someone else to find. It read, this assessment cannot determine whether forward attachment is a cultural construct, a trained psychological state, or a species-level trait. The distinction may be academic. The operational implications are not. She found Torres in the training courtyard that evening. He was alone, running a combat drill, no simulation, no partner, simply movement patterns against empty air, the kind of solo practice that did not make obvious sense unless you understood it as the maintenance of a skill the way you maintain anything you intend to keep using. She watched for a moment before she spoke. I need to ask you something that may be outside the boundaries of what an instructor is supposed to ask a cadet, she said. He stopped, turned, and waited. Reyes, she said. The name hung in the air. She watched his face. Dura Station. Something changed. Very small. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. She's alive, he said. Velthara hadn't known that. She had assumed the footage had not shown a resolution, and the classification markers had prevented her from accessing the full record. She survived. The settlement did, he said. She survived because of that. That's not, Velthara stopped. From a pure probability standpoint, her survival was, I know what the probability was, Torres said quietly, without edge. The courtyard was silent around them. Somewhere above the academy's roof, the first stars of the evening were becoming visible through the atmospheric dome. Why? Velthara asked. She was aware it was not a precise question. She was aware that a scientist asking why without specifying the referent was not doing good science. She asked it anyway. Torres looked up at the emerging stars for a moment. Then he looked back at her. Because 4,000 people needed someone to decide they mattered more than the math, he said, and she was the one standing there. Velthara stood in the courtyard for a long time after he went inside. She was standing there when the notification reached her datapad. Urgent flag, Hegemony Strategic Command, highest priority channel. It read, Incident at the Veth Corridor. Human civilian vessel, unarmed, interposed itself between a hegemony patrol line and a refugee convoy during a contested zone transit. Vessel sustained catastrophic damage. Captain survived. Requests acknowledgement of convoy's safe passage before accepting medical assistance. Command requires immediate guidance. How do we respond to a species that does this automatically? She stared at the message. How do we respond to a species that does this automatically? She had spent 9 years building a curriculum around threat classification, around capability matrices and resource assessments, and tactical probability modeling. 9 years of teaching cadets to understand the galaxy by understanding what each species could do. She had never once in 9 years built a single lecture around what a species was willing to stop doing. She typed her response to Strategic Command. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. We don't classify them as a threat level. We reclassify the question. The question is not, what are humans capable of? The question is, what are humans not capable of stopping themselves from doing? Those are not the same taxonomy. I recommend we adjourn the strategic threat classification framework entirely and begin again. I can have a revised proposal in 30 days. She sent it. Waited. Strategic Command responded in 4 minutes, which was, for the hegemony bureaucratic apparatus, essentially instantaneous. It meant someone had been waiting for that message. Someone had been ready. The response contained 2 words. 30 days. She was back in the lecture hall the next morning. 219 cadets. 31 species. 11 humans, distributed across the room in ones and twos with their characteristic stillness. She stood at the lectern and looked up at the rings of seats above her. She looked at Dreshaneth in his row, who had stood up 3 weeks ago because his body had stood before his mind decided to, and had asked a question she hadn't been prepared to answer. She looked at Torres, 3 seats away from Dreshaneth, hands flat on the surface in front of him, face quiet. She had prepared a new lesson. I'm going to begin, she said, by telling you that everything I taught you in this room 3 weeks ago was built on a measurement error. The hall went very still. I was measuring capabilities, she said. I was measuring what species could do what they could field, what they could sustain, what their tactical ceiling was. I was building you a map of the galaxy based on what each species was able to accomplish, and I was wrong. Not because the data was false. The data was accurate. I was wrong because capability is the least important variable in strategic assessment. She paused. The silence was the held breath kind again. The most important variable, she said, is what a species is willing to endure in order to keep going. She looked at the screen behind her blank now, no footage cued, and then back at her students. 40%, she said. 40% of all documented human military engagements contain what we have been filing as anomalous persistence events. We have been treating them as outliers. We have been treating them as outliers. We have been treating people like Reyes and Vasquez as statistical noise. She let that sit for a moment. They are not statistical noise. They are the signal. And we built our entire model around not hearing it. Dreshaneth was leaning forward. Several cadets around him were leaning forward. The 11 human cadets were not leaning forward. They were sitting exactly as they had been sitting. They had the quality, she thought, of people who had already heard the thing being said and were watching the room discover it. The hegemony strategic framework asks, of any species, what will they do? Veltara said, I am proposing that the correct question is different. The correct question is, what will they not stop doing? Even when every rational analysis says they should have stopped already. She pressed a key on her lectern. The screen behind her lit up, not with footage, but with a number. 40%. Just the number, clean and large against the white of the display. Today, she said, we begin learning to read that. The lesson that followed lasted 3 hours. She had planned for 90 minutes. The questions would not stop, and she did not make them stop. Dreshaneth asked 11 questions. Several of them she could not fully answer. The human cadets asked very few questions. They listened with that careful stillness. Once, only once, Tors raised his hand. Yes, Valentara said. The Dura Station settlement, he said. 4,000 people. The follow-up assessment, did Command ever log how many of them survived the next 6 months? The resettlement period? Valtera blinked. She had not looked at the follow-up assessment. She pulled it on her tablet, searching. 3,891. Survival rate of the settlement through the resettlement period, 97.3%. She looked up from her tablet, looked at Torres. "Why did you want to know that?" she asked. "Because Reyes will want to know," he said simply, "and I'll see her in 2 months." Vilthera filed her revised curriculum proposal 30 days later, exactly on schedule. It ran to 140 pages. It dismantled the threat classification hierarchy entirely and replaced it with a new framework built around a concept she had spent 2 weeks trying to name correctly before settling, finally, on the human term she had encountered in the psychological assessment: forward attachment. The proposal was reviewed by 7 senior hegemony analysts. It was revised, debated, partially redacted, and ultimately approved with modifications in 14 weeks fast for the hegemony, conspicuously fast for the hegemony. The modified version removed one section she had considered the most important. The section described what happened historically when species that operated on rational survival calculus encountered species that did not. The removed section's conclusion was not complicated. It was, in fact, very simple. The rational species consistently underestimated the irrational one, not because they lacked intelligence, because they lacked the imaginative capacity to believe that any mind at all would genuinely choose to continue past the point where continuation made sense. She kept the removed section in a private file. She read it sometimes late in the evening when the hall was empty and the stars were coming through the dome. She thought about Torres saying, "What will accept losing to keep doing it?" She thought about Reyes saying, "Okay, different priorities now." She thought about Vasquez 47 seconds, alone, in a corridor on a moon most people in the hegemony had never heard of, making a choice that the entire hegemony strategic framework had spent decades describing as extraordinary, as the far edge of what was possible. The far edge, 40%. She thought sometimes about the civilian vessel captain, the one who had interposed an unarmed ship between a patrol line and a refugee convoy, and then, surviving by some margin of chance that defied the probability analysis, had requested acknowledgement of the convoy's safe passage before accepting medical assistance. Before accepting medical assistance, she had eventually learned the captain's name. She had not looked it up intentionally. It had appeared in a follow-up administrative report she'd received about the corridor incident. The name was unremarkable. The captain was 51 years old by human reckoning, had been running civilian transport for 23 years, had no prior military record, had no documented heroism citations, had been, by every metric the hegemony used to identify the individuals who did exceptional things, completely invisible, normal. That was the thing that kept her awake. Not that humans had people like Vasquez and Reyes in the convoy captain. Every species had outliers. Every species had individuals who brushed the upper boundaries of what the species could produce. The thing that kept her awake was the 40%. The thing that kept her awake was the psychological assessment's final sentence, sitting at the bottom of 32 pages like a stone dropped into deep water. The distinction may be academic. The operational implications are not. The galaxy had been watching the exceptions, the anomalies, the moments that got classified and filed and discussed in academy lecture halls as illustrations of extremity. The galaxy had not been asking how many of those moments were happening in the dark, unobserved, unrecorded, not because they were rare, but because they were ordinary, because they were happening in corridors no one was filming, on ships no one was tracking, and the small, unremarkable decisions of 51-year-old civilian transport captains who simply looked at a refugee convoy and did the math and then set the math aside. She sat in her office one night near the end of that academic year, the hall quiet around her, the dome showing its full spread of stars. She had a final question she had not asked Torres. She had not asked it because she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. She sent him a message. One question. You don't have to answer, why do you keep going when you know you can't win? What is it, specifically, that makes a person keep going? His response came 40 minutes later, which meant he had sat with it. It read, I don't think it's about winning or not winning. I think it's about what you'd have to become to stop. And most of us, when we look at that, decide we'd rather keep going, she read it once. Then she turned off her desk light and looked at the stars for a long time, and she thought about a species that had looked at the universe vast, cold, indifferent, full of powers larger than themselves, and had decided that what they were unwilling to become was more important than what they were unable to survive. The galaxy had spent centuries asking what humans could do. It had never thought to be frightened by what they refused to stop being.